Welcome to the world of science fiction, where extraordinary stories come to life. If you've subscribed for more stories, enjoy the ride now. Sergeant David Chen had always believed that the space between opposing armies was where common sense went to die a particularly stupid death, but the heat signature on his thermal scanner was suggesting that today, it might be where his career in the Colonial Marines joined it. The readout showed something small, warm, and definitely biological sitting in the middle of what military strategists politely called contested territory, and everyone else called that place where people go to become statistics. "Sarge, you seeing this?" Corporal Martinez leaned over David's shoulder, squinting at the scanner display with the expression of someone whose worldview was being gently violated by technology. "That's way too small to be enemy combatants, and it's been sitting in the same position for 6 hours. David adjusted the scanner's sensitivity, hoping the reading would resolve into something that made tactical sense. Abandoned equipment, maybe, or some kind of Rex reconnaissance drone that had malfunctioned in a convenient location. Instead, the signature became clearer and more obviously organic, with the kind of heat distribution that suggested something alive, small, and probably not equipped with military-grade weapons systems. "It's about the size of a human child," David said, though he was already dreading where that observation was going to take his thinking. "But we're 40 kilometers from the nearest civilian evacuation zone, and this sector's been under active bombardment for 3 days. "Could be Vrex," suggested Private Wong, who had the kind of optimism that military service hadn't quite managed to crush yet. "Maybe they're smaller than our intel suggests." David looked through his field glasses at the crater where the heat signature was located, a blast zone that had been carved out of Nexus Prime's rocky surface by something with serious destructive ambitions and questionable artistic sensibilities. The no-man's land between human and Vrex positions looked like a collaboration between a demolitions expert and someone with a pathological hatred of landscape architecture. "Vrex are 2 meters tall and built like armored bulldozers with anger management issues," David pointed out. "This thing is maybe a meter tall and hasn't moved position in hours. Either they've developed a new stealth technology that involves sitting perfectly still while being scanned by enemy equipment, or we're looking at something else entirely." "Something else like what?" Martinez asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer and wasn't going to like it. "Like a civilian casualty that got caught in the crossfire when the shooting started," David said, lowering his field glasses with the kind of careful precision that usually preceded decisions people would later describe as spectacularly poor judgment calls. The temporary ceasefire was holding, barely, while both sides exchanged prisoners and negotiated the terms for renewed hostilities. David's engineering unit had been tasked with maintaining sensor equipment and defensive positions during the lull, which should have been a routine assignment involving equipment maintenance and strategic boredom. Instead, David found himself staring at a thermal signature that was making his conscience perform uncomfortable gymnastics while his military training insisted that investigating unknown contacts in no man's land was the kind of idea that led to posthumous medals and very disappointed family members. "Sarge," Wong said carefully, "you're not thinking what I think you're thinking. I'm thinking that if there's a civilian trapped out there, they've been without food or water for 3 days in a combat zone that's scheduled to resume active bombardment in 4 hours, David replied. "I'm thinking that leaving someone to die because it's inconvenient or dangerous isn't the kind of person I want to be. You're also thinking about disobeying direct orders about maintaining defensive positions and not engaging in unauthorized reconnaissance," Martinez pointed out with the weary tone of someone who'd served with David long enough to recognize the warning signs of impending heroism. David activated his comm unit, connecting to Lieutenant Foster with the resigned efficiency of someone about to request permission for something that would probably result in creative military punishment. "Command, this is Engineering 7. We've got a possible civilian heat signature in Grid Square Delta 97. Requesting permission to investigate during ceasefire window." "Negative, Engineering 7. All personnel are to maintain current positions. Unknown contacts are not your concern." David looked at his scanner, where the small heat signature continued to show the same stationary position it had held for hours. Whatever was out there wasn't moving, which suggested either death or injury serious enough to prevent mobility. "Command, thermal indicates possible child-sized civilian casualty." Individual appears incapacitated and may require immediate medical assistance. Engineering 7, you are not authorized for search and rescue operations. Maintain your position and monitor equipment. That's an order. David stared at the comm unit for several seconds, weighing the competing demands of military discipline and basic human decency. His engineering training had taught him to calculate risks and solve problems using available resources. His conscience was suggesting that some problems were worth solving regardless of the calculated risks. Martinez, how long until artillery resumes? 3 hours, 47 minutes, assuming both sides stick to the negotiated schedule. Wong, what's our fastest route to grid square Delta 97? Straight line through no man's land, about 15 minutes each way if we avoid the automated turrets and don't get shot by either side. Wong paused, studying David's expression with growing concern. Sarge, please tell me you're not planning what I think you're planning. I'm planning to take a quick walk to investigate a possible civilian casualty, David said, checking his sidearm and emergency medical kit with movements that suggested the decision had already been made. Purely in the interests of gathering intelligence about battlefield conditions. That's the worst cover story I've ever heard, Martinez said. And I once heard a guy try to explain why he was found in the mess hall at 0300 hours wearing nothing but a cooking apron and a guilty expression. David activated his personal beacon and began checking his equipment with the methodical efficiency of someone whose survival was about to depend on being very good at improvised solutions to unexpected problems. You two stay here and maintain comm contact. If this goes badly, you follow orders and don't come after me. Sarge, this is insane, Martinez said. You're talking about crossing active battlefield to investigate something that might not even be human, could be a trap, and is definitely going to get you court-martialed if you survive. Yeah, probably, David agreed, adjusting his helmet's tactical display to show the optimal route through the crater field. But if it is a kid out there, and if they're still alive, then 3 hours from now when the shooting starts again, they're going to die alone and scared in a hole in the ground. I can live with court-martial. I can't live with that. David's route through no man's land required navigation skills he'd learned in engineering school and survival instincts he'd acquired through 4 years of combat deployments. The terrain was a maze of blast craters, twisted metal debris, and automated defense systems from both armies that were currently observing the ceasefire but might resume targeting protocols without warning. The Vrex had a particular fondness for plasma weaponry that left perfectly circular holes in the landscape, while human forces favored kinetic weapons that created more traditional craters with interesting patterns of secondary debris. The combination had turned the battlefield into a geological survey of creative destruction techniques. David's comm crackled with Martinez's voice as he approached the target grid square. Sarge, thermal shows you're about 50 meters from the signature. Any visual confirmation? Negative, still approaching. David crested a small ridge and found himself looking down into a crater that was larger and more complex than the thermal scanner had suggested. Definitely evidence of recent plasma bombardment. Multiple impact sites, some kind of structure that's been mostly vaporized. Structure. David studied the debris pattern with an engineer's eye for reconstructing original configurations. Looks like it might have been a small dwelling or shelter. Maybe a refugee camp that got caught in the crossfire. Any sign of survivors? David activated his suit's enhanced optics and began scanning the crater more carefully. What he found made his stomach perform an uncomfortable series of acrobatic maneuvers that had nothing to do with the terrain he'd been crossing. There, huddled in the deepest part of the blast crater, was definitely not a human child. The being was small, fragile-looking, and possessed of features that were clearly alien but somehow managed to trigger every protective instinct David had developed over 32 years of life. Delicate wings that seemed to be made of something like translucent crystal, large compound eyes that reflected the harsh sunlight of Nexus Prime in patterns too complex for David's brain to process, and skin that shifted through colors in ways that probably indicated emotional states he couldn't begin to interpret. Oh, hell, David breathed into his comm. Martinez, we've got a problem. What kind of problem? The kind where it's definitely a child, definitely alive, and definitely not human. David began his descent into the crater, moving carefully to avoid triggering any automated defenses that might still be active. Looks like Kaelari, based on the wings and coloration. Kids maybe 5 or 6 years old by human standards. Kaelari? Sarge, they're non-combatants. Refugees. What's a Kaelari child doing in no man's land? David reached the bottom of the crater and got his first close look at the alien child, who was clearly injured, dehydrated, and terrified beyond anything David's experience with human children had prepared him to handle. One wing was damaged, hanging at an angle that suggested broken bones or torn membranes, and the child's skin was cycling through colors that David's instincts interpreted as distress signals. Looks like their shelter got hit during the bombardment 3 days ago, David reported, studying the debris pattern around the crater. Kid's been trapped here ever since. The Kaelari child noticed David's approach and made sounds that were definitely not human language but somehow managed to convey terror, pain, and what might have been a plea for help. The large compound eyes focused on David with an intensity that was both alien and completely recognizable as the expression of someone who'd given up hope and suddenly found a reason to reconsider. "Hey there, little one," David said softly, using the same tone he'd use with any scared child despite having no idea whether Kaelari even understood vocal inflection. "I'm David. I'm here to help." The child's coloration shifted to patterns that seemed less chaotic, though David had no frame of reference for interpreting Kaelari emotional states. He activated his medical scanner, which immediately began displaying readings that made about as much sense as Vrek's poetry translated through a malfunctioning universal translator. "Martinez, I'm reading severe dehydration, possible infection from the wing injury, and what looks like hypothermia, though I have no idea what constitutes normal body temperature for Kaelari. Can you move her?" David looked at the child, who was watching him with obvious intelligence despite the obvious physical distress. "She's conscious and alert, but that wing injury is going to make transport complicated." "And Martinez?" "Yeah, Sarge. I think she understands that I'm trying to help. She's not fighting me, just watching everything I do like she's trying to figure out whether I'm trustworthy." David began a careful examination of the child's injuries, using techniques adapted from first aid training that had never covered alien physiology. The wing damage was the most obvious problem, but his scanner indicated internal issues that were beyond his ability to address in the field. "Little one, I'm going to pick you up now," David said, speaking slowly and keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I know it's going to hurt, but I need to get you somewhere safe." The Kaelari child made soft sounds that David chose to interpret as understanding, though they might just as easily have been alien expressions of resignation. When David carefully lifted her, she was lighter than he'd expected and seemed to instinctively curl against his chest in a way that suggested Kaelari children had similar comfort-seeking behaviors to human young. "Martinez, beginning extraction. ETA to friendly lines is 25 minutes if everything goes according to plan." "Since when do things ever go according to plan when you're involved?" David began his careful ascent from the crater, the Kaelari child cradled in his arms like the most fragile cargo he'd ever transported. "Fair point. Better make that 40 minutes and have medical standing by." The journey back through no man's land was complicated by the child's obvious pain and David's complete lack of experience with alien pediatric care. The Kaelari child made soft sounds that were probably expressions of discomfort, but she seemed to understand that David was helping rather than harming her, curling against his armor in a way that made his protective instincts override every concern about military protocol. "Sarge, you've got incoming," Martinez's voice carried sharp urgency. "2 Vrek's patrol drones, heading toward your position. They're not supposed to be active during ceasefire, but somebody apparently forgot to tell them that." David looked around for cover, finding himself in the middle of relatively open terrain with limited options for concealment. The Kaelari child in his arms seemed to sense the increased tension, her coloration shifting to what David was learning to recognize as fear patterns. "It's okay, little one," David said quietly. "Just a minor complication. Nothing we can't handle." David found concealment behind a twisted piece of hull plating from some destroyed vehicle, crouching low while the Vrex drones passed overhead with the mechanical efficiency of predators following predetermined search patterns. The child remained perfectly still during the encounter, as if she understood that survival depended on not being detected. "Clear," Martinez reported after the drones had moved on. "But Sarge, ceasefire ends in 90 minutes, and you're still 15 minutes from friendly lines." David resumed his careful progress through the cratered landscape, the alien child's weight seeming to increase with every step as exhaustion and stress took their toll on his endurance. But every time he looked down at her large compound eyes, he found the motivation to keep moving. "Almost there, little one," David said as the human defensive perimeter came into view. "Almost safe." The child made soft sounds that David chose to interpret as gratitude, though they might have been alien observations about the questionable judgment of humans who risked court-martial to rescue strangers. Either way, David figured he'd made the right choice, regardless of what his commanding officers were going to say about his interpretation of military protocol. The human field medical station wasn't designed for alien physiology, a fact that became painfully obvious when David arrived carrying a Kaelari child whose biology apparently operated on principles that human medical science had never considered. Dr. Sarah Kim, the unit's medic, took one look at her newest patient and delivered the kind of professional assessment that made David's rescue mission feel significantly more complicated. "Sergeant Chen, I appreciate the humanitarian gesture, but I have absolutely no idea how to treat a Kaelari child," Dr. Kim said, her medical scanner producing readings that looked like abstract art designed by someone with strong opinions about chaos theory. "Her physiology is completely outside my training, and everything I know about emergency medicine assumes carbon-based life forms that breathe oxygen and have circulatory systems I can actually identify." David looked down at the alien child he'd carried across a battlefield, who was now lying on a medical examination table that was obviously too large for her small frame. Her coloration had shifted to what he was learning to recognize as exhaustion patterns, and her damaged wing hung at an angle that made David's stomach clench with sympathetic pain. "Doc, she's been trapped in no man's land for 3 days without food or water. Whatever we don't know about Kaelari medicine, we know she's going to die if we don't figure something out. And she might die if we do the wrong thing trying to help her," Dr. Kim replied, though she was already beginning a careful examination with the methodical approach of someone who'd learned to adapt medical protocols to unexpected situations. "Kaelari have different atmospheric requirements than humans, their metabolism runs on photosynthetic processes we don't understand, and their emotional state seems directly connected to their physical health in ways that could complicate any treatment." David watched as the child tracked Dr. Kim's movements with obvious intelligence, her large compound eyes reflecting the medical bay's lighting in patterns that created an almost hypnotic effect. "She understands what's happening, document look at her, she knows we're trying to help. Understanding doesn't change the fact that I could accidentally poison her with the wrong medication or cause allergic reactions with treatments that are perfectly safe for humans." Dr. Kim paused her examination to consult her medical database, which was producing error messages in multiple languages. According to this, Kaelari children require specific atmospheric pressure, filtered light exposure, and some kind of mineral supplement that human field medical units don't carry. The child made soft sounds that seemed to carry undertones of distress, her coloration shifting to deeper, more turbulent patterns. David moved closer to the examination table, and her eyes immediately focused on him with what looked like relief. "She responds to me," David observed. "When I get closer, her colors calm down. When I talk to her, she seems less agitated." "Kaelari are social creatures," Dr. Kim said, checking her database for relevant information. "Their children require constant emotional connection with trusted adults for proper physical development. Isolation or separation anxiety can literally manifest as physical illness in their species." David carefully placed his hand on the child's small arm, feeling the strange texture of skin that seemed to shift slightly under his touch. Her coloration immediately brightened, cycling through patterns that David's instincts identified as contentment or relief. "So she needs me to stay close for medical reasons?" "She needs someone she trusts to stay close, or her physical condition will deteriorate regardless of whatever other treatment we provide. Dr. Kim began adapting her medical equipment for alien physiology, jury-rigging atmospheric processors and light filters with the creative problem-solving skills that military medics develop through necessity. Congratulations, Sergeant. You're now officially this child's emotional support system. David found himself appointed as both translator and therapeutic presence while Dr. Kim worked to address the child's immediate medical needs. The wing injury was the most obvious problem, but treating it required understanding bone structure and healing processes that were completely different from human anatomy. Her wing bones are hollow, like bird bones, but they're made of some kind of crystalline material that's both stronger and more fragile than human bone, Dr. Kim explained as she worked. The break is clean, which is good, but I have no idea what kind of setting material will work with her biology. David watched the child's face, or what he assumed was her face, for signs of pain as Dr. Kim examined the damaged wing. Her coloration shifted through patterns that seemed to indicate discomfort, but she remained perfectly still during the examination, as if she understood that cooperation was necessary for treatment. Can you fix it? I can immobilize it and hope her natural healing processes take care of the rest, Dr. Kim said, beginning to construct a wing brace from medical splinting material and engineering components that David contributed from his equipment kit. But Kaelari healing requires specific environmental conditions that we can't provide in a field medical station. David's engineering training kicked in as he studied the child's obvious environmental needs. What kind of conditions? Specific light wavelengths that promote cellular regeneration, atmospheric pressure that's about 20% lower than Earth normal, and some kind of mineral-rich mist that their skin absorbs for hydration and nutrition. I can rig up an environmental chamber using equipment from my engineering kit, David said, his mind already working through the technical challenges involved. Jury-rig some atmospheric processors, set up filtered lighting arrays, maybe adapt the base's water recycling system to produce the mineral solutions she needs. You're talking about building a life support system for an alien child using spare parts and creative engineering. I'm talking about keeping her alive using whatever resources we have available, David corrected. It's just another engineering problem that happens to have higher stakes than usual. David spent the next several hours transforming a section of the medical bay into what he privately thought of as alien pediatric intensive care, using atmospheric processors designed for hostile environment operations, lighting equipment salvaged from various sources, and water filtration systems adapted to produce the mineral solutions that Dr. Kim's database suggested Kaelari physiology required. The child watched his work with obvious fascination, her coloration shifting to what David was learning to interpret as curiosity and interest. When he spoke to her during his construction process, she responded with soft sounds that seemed to carry musical qualities, as if her species communicated partially through tonal patterns. I think she likes watching you work, Dr. Kim observed as David tested the atmospheric settings in the improvised environmental chamber. Her vital signs improve whenever you're actively engaged in problem-solving activities near her. Maybe she's an engineer too, David said, adjusting the light frequency controls to match the specifications he'd found in the medical database. Or maybe she just appreciates seeing someone try to solve her problems instead of giving up because they're complicated. The environmental chamber, when activated, created a small pocket of atmosphere that was hopefully closer to what the child's biology required. David carefully moved her into the modified space, watching for signs of improvement or distress as her alien physiology responded to the changed conditions. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Her coloration brightened significantly, cycling through patterns that were clearly more vibrant and healthy than anything David had seen since finding her in the crater. Her breathing became easier, and her damaged wings seemed to settle into a more comfortable position within the improvised brace. It's working, Dr. Kim said with obvious relief. Her vital signs are stabilizing, and the wing injury is showing early signs of healing response. David settled into a chair beside the environmental chamber, maintaining the physical proximity that seemed to be necessary for the child's emotional stability. How long until we know if she's going to be okay? With human patients, I'd say 24 to 48 hours for initial recovery assessment. With Kaelari physiology, Dr. Kim shrugged. I have no idea. We're in completely uncharted medical territory. The child made soft musical sounds that David was beginning to recognize as attempts at communication. He responded with equally soft human words, creating a kind of cross-species conversation that probably made no linguistic sense but seemed to provide emotional comfort for both participants. I think she's trying to tell me her name, David said after several minutes of this exchange. The sounds she makes have patterns, like she's repeating the same sequence when she looks at herself. Try repeating the sounds back to her. See if she responds positively to your pronunciation. David attempted to mimic the musical tones the child produced, his human vocal cord struggling to reproduce the harmonic complexities of Kaelari language. His efforts were clearly imperfect, but the child's coloration shifted to what he was learning to recognize as amusement, and she repeated the sounds with what seemed like encouraging patience. I'm going to call you Kira, David said finally, giving up on accurate pronunciation of alien names. It means light in an old Earth language, and you seem to be made of light in all kinds of ways. The child, Kira, responded with sounds that David chose to interpret as approval, though they might just as easily have been alien commentary on human linguistic limitations. Either way, she seemed to accept the name, responding when David used it and making contented sounds when he spoke to her directly. Lieutenant Foster's arrival at the medical bay brought David back to the military reality he'd temporarily forgotten while focused on alien pediatric care. The lieutenant's expression suggested that David's rescue mission had attracted considerably more attention than he'd hoped. Sergeant Chen, I need a full report on your unauthorized excursion into no man's land, Foster said, though his attention was clearly divided between military protocol and obvious fascination with their alien patient. Sir, thermal scans indicated a possible civilian casualty in contested territory. I conducted a reconnaissance mission to investigate and discovered a Kaelari child trapped in a blast crater. The individual required immediate medical attention and extraction to prevent death from exposure and untreated injuries. You conducted an unauthorized mission in violation of direct orders to maintain defensive positions. Yes, sir. I judged the humanitarian concerns to outweigh the tactical. The human field medical station wasn't designed for alien physiology, a fact that became painfully obvious when David arrived carrying a Kaelari child whose biology apparently operated on principles that human medical science had never considered. Dr. Sarah Kim, the unit's medic, took one look at her newest patient and delivered the kind of professional assessment that made David's rescue mission feel significantly more complicated. Sergeant Chen, I appreciate the humanitarian gesture, but I have absolutely no idea how to treat a Kaelari child, Dr. Kim said, her medical scanner producing readings that looked like abstract art designed by someone with strong opinions about chaos theory. Her physiology is completely outside my training, and everything I know about emergency medicine assumes carbon-based life forms that breathe oxygen and have circulatory systems I can actually identify. David looked down at the alien child he'd carried across a battlefield, who was now lying on a medical examination table that was obviously too large for her small frame. Her coloration had shifted to what he was learning to recognize as exhaustion patterns, and her damaged wing hung at an angle that made David's stomach clench with sympathetic pain. Doc, she's been trapped in no man's land for 3 days without food or water. Whatever we don't know about Kaelari medicine, we know she's going to die if we don't figure something out. And she might die if we do the wrong thing trying to help her, Dr. Kim replied, though she was already beginning a careful examination with the methodical approach of someone who'd learned to adapt medical protocols to unexpected situations. Kaelari have different atmospheric requirements than humans, their metabolism runs on photosynthetic processes we don't understand, and their emotional state seems directly connected to their physical health in ways that could complicate any treatment. David watched as the child tracked Dr. Kim's movements with obvious intelligence, her large compound eyes reflecting the medical bay's lighting in patterns that created an almost hypnotic effect. She understands what's happening, document look at her, she knows we're trying to help. Understanding doesn't change the fact that I could accidentally poison her with the wrong medication or cause allergic reactions with treatments that are perfectly safe for humans. Dr. Kim paused her examination to consult her medical database, which was producing error messages in multiple languages. According to this, Kaelari children require specific atmospheric pressure, filtered light exposure, and some kind of 3 weeks after David had pulled Kira from no man's land, the war on Nexus Prime officially ended with a ceasefire agreement that satisfied no one but at least stopped people from shooting at each other with quite so much enthusiasm. David found himself in the unprecedented position of being a combat engineer responsible for the care and feeding of an alien child whose legal status remained somewhere between diplomatic curiosity and administrative nightmare. The temporary refugee processing center that had been established in the former combat zone was a study in bureaucratic confusion, filled with humans who specialized in military logistics trying to figure out how to handle displaced civilians from 3 different species. Kira had become the center's unofficial mascot, though David suspected her popularity had more to do with her small size and obvious intelligence than any real understanding of Kaelari culture among the staff. "Her wing is healing beautifully, Dr. Kim reported during their daily medical assessment. "The crystalline bone structure is regenerating faster than I would have expected, and she's regained about 60% of her mobility. At this rate, she should have full flight capability within another month." David watched Kira practice moving her injured wing under Dr. Kim's supervision, her coloration cycling through patterns that he'd learned to associate with concentration and determination. Her progress over the past weeks had been remarkable, but David had begun to worry about what would happen when she was fully recovered and no longer required constant medical supervision. "Any word from the xenobiologists about placement options?" David asked, though he was dreading the answer. "The official word is that she's a unique interspecies custody situation that requires extensive consultation with appropriate authorities," Dr. Kim replied with the tone of someone quoting bureaucratic doublespeak. "The unofficial word is that nobody has any idea what to do with a Kaelari war orphan, and everyone's hoping someone else will volunteer to make it their problem." Kira finished her wing exercises and moved to David's side with the easy confidence of someone who'd learned that he represented safety and stability in an otherwise chaotic situation. She made the soft musical sounds that had become their primary form of communication, supplemented by gestures and drawings that bridged the language gap between human speech and Kaelari tonal patterns. "She's asking about the other Kaelari," David translated, interpreting Kira's sounds and gestures with the fluency he developed through weeks of constant interaction. "She wants to know if any of her people survived the attacks on the refugee ships." Dr. Kim's expression softened as she looked at Kira, who was watching their conversation with the kind of hopeful attention that made David's chest tighten with protective instincts. "There are survivor reports coming in from other sectors. Some Kaelari refugee groups made it to neutral space before the attacks escalated. But tracking individual families is going to be nearly impossible, especially when we don't even know her full name or which refugee group she was traveling with," David finished. He crouched down to Kira's level, meeting her large compound eyes directly. "We're still looking, little one. But it might take some time." Kira's coloration shifted through patterns that David had learned to recognize as sadness mixed with acceptance, as if she understood that her family might be gone forever but was trying to process that reality with the resilience that seemed characteristic of her species. She moved closer to David, seeking the physical contact that provided emotional comfort and seemed necessary for her continued psychological health. The arrival of Commander Sarah Torres brought a level of authority to the refugee center that suggested David's situation with Kira was about to become significantly more official. Commander Torres had the kind of reputation that made junior officers nervous and alien children curious, though Kira's response to her presence was immediate fascination rather than fear. "Sergeant Chen, I've been reviewing your reports about our young guest," Commander Torres said, her attention divided between David and Kira, who was studying the commander's uniform decorations with obvious interest. "Her case has attracted attention from colonial administration, the Interspecies Council, and apparently several xenobiology research institutions that would very much like to study her development." David felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Study her, ma'am?" "Academic research into Kaelari child development, social bonding patterns, and adaptation to non-species environments," Torres clarified. "Nothing harmful, but extensive observation and documentation that would require her placement in a research facility for an indefinite period." A research facility where she'd be separated from the social bonds she needs for healthy development. David's protective instincts were clearly audible in his voice, despite his efforts to maintain proper military courtesy. The research institutions assure me they would provide appropriate care and social interaction. David looked at Kira, who had moved to stand directly beside him, one small hand resting on his arm in the gesture of connection that had become automatic for both of them. With respect, ma'am, appropriate care for Kaelari children requires constant emotional bonding with trusted adults. She's not a research subject, she's a kid who's already lost everything once. I won't let her be treated like a laboratory specimen. Commander Torres studied David's expression with the assessing gaze of someone who'd learned to recognize when subordinates had reached non-negotiable positions. And what would you suggest as an alternative, Sergeant? I suggest she stays with me, David said, surprised by how certain he sounded. I've been caring for her for 3 weeks. I understand her needs, I can communicate with her, and she's bonded to me in ways that seem necessary for her psychological health. If the colonial administration needs someone to take responsibility for a Kaelari war orphan, I volunteer. You're volunteering to adopt an alien child whose species, culture, and biological needs are completely outside human experience. I'm volunteering to continue caring for a child who trusts me, who's been through enough trauma for several lifetimes, and who deserves better than being studied like a curiosity by people who see her as an interesting research opportunity rather than a person. Kira made soft musical sounds that carried undertones David had learned to recognize as anxiety, as if she could sense the tension in the conversation even without understanding the specific words. David placed his hand on her small shoulder, providing the physical reassurance that seemed to calm her whenever she became distressed. Ma'am, look at her, David continued. She's smart, she's resilient, she's already learned to adapt to human social patterns while maintaining her own cultural identity. She doesn't need to be studied, she needs to be raised by someone who sees her as family rather than as a fascinating example of interspecies development. Commander Torres crouched down to Kira's level, speaking in the gentle tone that experienced officers used with civilian casualties. Hello, little one. I'm Commander Torres. David has been taking very good care of you. Kira responded with musical sounds that seemed more complex than usual, with harmonics and tonal patterns that suggested she was trying to communicate something specific. She pointed at David, then at herself, then made gestures that seemed to indicate connection or belonging. I think she's trying to tell you that David is her family now, Dr. Kim interpreted from her position near the medical monitoring equipment. Is that accurate? Torres asked David directly. David looked at Kira, who was watching him with the kind of absolute trust that made every protective instinct he possessed snap to attention. Over the past 3 weeks, he'd learned her preferences for food and light, her sleep patterns and social needs, her ways of expressing joy and frustration and curiosity about the world around her. He'd become fluent in her tonal communication patterns and learned to read her emotional states through the complex color changes in her skin. More importantly, he'd learned that caring for her had given his own life a purpose that went far beyond military objectives or career advancement. Watching her heal and grow and adapt to her new circumstances had become the most meaningful work he'd ever done. Yes, ma'am, David said quietly. She's family. Commander Torres stood up, her expression cycling through professional assessment and what might have been personal approval. Sergeant Chen, you realize that adopting a Kaelari child would require significant lifestyle changes, specialized training in interspecies child development, and probably reassignment to duties that would allow you to provide appropriate parental care. I realize that, ma'am. I also realize that she's already lost one family to this war, and she shouldn't have to lose another one to bureaucratic convenience or scientific curiosity. Very well. I'll begin the paperwork for interspecies adoption and guardianship transfer. But Sergeant, this arrangement will require oversight from xenobiology specialists, regular developmental assessments, and probably involvement from Kaelari cultural authorities when we can establish contact with surviving communities. David nodded, understanding that official adoption would mean trading military autonomy for the kind of scrutiny that came with being responsible for the welfare of an alien child. I understand, ma'am. Whatever oversight is necessary to ensure Kira gets the best possible care. Kira made sounds that David recognized as her version of his name, followed by tonal patterns that he'd learned meant safety and contentment. She leaned against his leg with the casual affection of someone who'd found her place in the world and intended to stay there. There is one more thing, Sergeant, Commander Torres said. We've received communications from surviving Kaelari refugee groups. They've heard about the human soldier who rescued one of their children, and they're requesting diplomatic contact. Apparently, your actions have created some interesting possibilities for interspecies relations. Possibilities? The Kaelari elders want to discuss formal alliance agreements with human colonies, partly based on their assessment of human character as demonstrated by your willingness to risk your life for one of their children. Torres smiled slightly. Congratulations, Sergeant. Your humanitarian instincts may have accidentally prevented a much larger conflict and opened diplomatic channels that could benefit both species. David looked down at Kira, who was practicing moving her healing wing while making the contented sounds that indicated she was happy with her current circumstances. I didn't rescue her to start diplomatic initiatives, ma'am. I rescued her because she was a hurt kid who needed help. I know, Sergeant. That's exactly why the Kaelari want to talk to us. Apparently, species that rescue children from battlefields without expecting political benefit are considered worthwhile alliance partners. As Commander Torres left to begin the complex process of formalizing David's guardianship of Kira, David settled into his chair beside her practice area, watching as she experimented with flight movements under Dr. Kim's supervision. Her progress was remarkable, but more important was her obvious happiness and sense of security in her new life. So, Kira, David said, using the combination of English words and musical tones that had become their shared language, how do you feel about having a human dad who doesn't know the first thing about raising alien kids? Kira's response was a series of musical sounds that carried unmistakable overtones of affection and amusement, followed by gestures that seemed to indicate that she was perfectly willing to teach him whatever he needed to know. Her coloration shifted to the bright, vibrant patterns that David had learned meant joy and contentment. Yeah, David said, watching as she attempted a short hover with her healing wings, I think we're going to figure this out just fine. 2 years after David had carried Kira out of no man's land, the colony world of Haven's Rest looked nothing like the battlefield where their relationship had begun. The settlement that had grown up around the former refugee processing center was a study in successful interspecies cooperation, with architecture that blended human engineering practicality with Kaelari aesthetic sensibilities and Vrek structural innovations that made the entire community look like someone had successfully negotiated a peace treaty between 3 different approaches to civilization. David's morning routine now included checking atmospheric conditions in Kira's bedroom, adjusting light frequencies for optimal Kaelari development, and preparing breakfast that met the nutritional requirements of a rapidly growing alien child whose dietary needs remained more art than science. Kira, now 7 by human developmental standards and approaching adolescence in Kaelari terms, had adapted to human social patterns while maintaining the cultural identity that connected her to her own people. Dad, the wing exercises are boring, Kira announced in the perfect English she'd mastered over the past 18 months, though her communication still included tonal harmonics that added emotional context to her words. I can fly perfectly now. Dr. Kim says my mobility is better than most adult Kaelari. David looked up from the atmospheric processor he was calibrating, watching as Kira demonstrated her point by executing a perfect hover pattern around their kitchen. Her wings had healed completely, developing the full range of motion and strength that allowed her to move through 3-dimensional space with the fluid grace that made human locomotion look clumsy by comparison. The exercises aren't just about mobility, little one, David replied, using the combination of spoken words and musical tones that had become natural for both of them. They're about building strength and control that you'll need as you get older and your wings continue developing. I know that, Kira said with the exasperated patience of someone explaining obvious facts to someone who clearly didn't understand the situation. But I want to help with the real work. The diplomatic meetings, the cultural exchange programs, the engineering projects that are building connections between our peoples. David studied his daughter, a word that had transitioned from legal designation to emotional reality somewhere during their first year together, as she settled onto her favorite perch near the kitchen window. Kira had grown from the terrified, injured child he'd found in a crater into a confident young person whose intelligence and curiosity seemed to exceed the boundaries of any single species' educational approaches. "You think the diplomatic work is more important than physical therapy?" "I think helping humans and Kaelari understand each other is more important than practicing flight patterns I already know how to do," Kira replied with the logic that had become characteristic of her approach to problem solving. "Besides, I'm one of only 3 Kaelari children in the colony. If we're going to build lasting relationships between our species, someone needs to understand both cultures from the inside." The door chime announced the arrival of Elder Thessarian, the Kaelari cultural advisor who had become both mentor to Kira and bridge between human and Kaelari perspectives on interspecies child rearing. The elder's presence filled their home with the same sense of ancient wisdom and gentle authority that characterized all adult Kaelari, though her obvious affection for Kira made her seem more like a beloved grandmother than a formal cultural representative. "Good morning, David." "Good morning, Bright Wing," Elder Thessarian said, using the Kaelari term of endearment that had become Kira's unofficial second name among her own people. "I hope you are both well." "We're fine, Elder," David replied, though he was still getting used to the formal courtesy that Kaelari culture required when addressing their elders. Kira was just explaining her theories about the relative importance of physical therapy versus diplomatic work. Elder Thessarian's coloration shifted to patterns that David had learned indicated amusement mixed with approval. "Ah, she wishes to participate in the cultural exchange programs rather than focus on individual development exercises." "Exactly," Kira said, her own coloration brightening with the kind of enthusiasm that made her opinions unmistakably clear. "Dad teaches me about human engineering and problem-solving approaches. You teach me about Kaelari history and cultural traditions. But I want to help other people learn to understand each other the way we do." "And what do you think you could teach them, Bright Wing?" Kira's response was immediate and confident. "I could teach humans that Kaelari emotional communication isn't primitive or inefficient, it's just a different way of sharing information that includes contexts human language doesn't carry. And I could teach Kaelari that human directness isn't rudeness or insensitivity, it's just a cultural approach to clarity that values efficiency over elaborate courtesy." David and Elder Thessarian exchanged glances, both of them recognizing that Kira had articulated insights about interspecies communication that had taken adult diplomats months to develop through formal negotiations. "She has been observing the cultural exchange sessions," Elder Thessarian said to David. "Her perspectives on human Kaelari interactions are remarkably sophisticated for someone her age." "She's been remarkably sophisticated about most things since the day I met her," David replied. "I think surviving what she survived, and adapting to a completely different species' social patterns, probably accelerated her emotional and intellectual development in ways that normal Kaelari childhood wouldn't. Or maybe I'm just naturally brilliant and you two haven't figured out how to keep up with me yet," Kira interjected with the kind of confidence that made both adults laugh despite themselves. The arrival of Dr. Kim with her monthly developmental assessment equipment brought their morning conversation back to the practical realities of raising an interspecies child whose growth patterns didn't match any established norms for either human or Kaelari development. "How's our favorite diplomatic prodigy doing?" Dr. Kim asked, setting up the sophisticated scanning equipment that had been specially modified to assess Kaelari physiology. "Any new developments since last month?" "Her wing strength has increased by another 15%, her language acquisition now includes 3 human dialects and formal Kaelari ceremonial speech, and she's apparently ready to revolutionize interspecies relations through the application of 7-year-old logic," David reported. 8-year-old logic, Kira corrected. "My birthday was last month, remember? We had cake that met both human and Kaelari nutritional requirements and somehow still managed to taste good." Dr. Kim began her examination with the easy familiarity of someone who'd been monitoring Kira's development since her rescue. "Your physical development is actually ahead of projections for both species. Kaelari children usually don't achieve full flight capability until age 9 or 10, and human children don't typically develop the kind of spatial reasoning skills you're demonstrating until adolescence. Maybe hybrid development patterns are different from single-species norms, Kira suggested with the casual confidence of someone proposing revolutionary theories about xenobiology. Maybe growing up with two different species approaches to learning creates cognitive advantages that neither species develops independently. Dr. Kim paused her examination to stare at Kira. Did you just hypothesize that interspecies child-rearing produces hybrid developmental advantages? Yes. Is that wrong? It's not wrong. It's the kind of insight that xenobiology researchers spend careers trying to develop, and you just articulated it as if it were obvious. Dr. Kim looked at David and Elder Thessarian. Have you two considered that you might be raising the first truly interspecies child in known galactic history? David looked at Kira, who was listening to the conversation with the focused attention of someone who found academic discussions about her own development genuinely interesting rather than embarrassing. I've considered that we're raising someone who's going to change how both species think about child development, cultural identity, and interspecies cooperation. I just hadn't thought of it in terms of creating entirely new developmental patterns. Dad, can I ask you something? Kira said with the tone that usually preceded questions that made David realize how much his daughter's thinking had evolved beyond his own understanding. Always, little one. When you found me in that crater, did you know that rescuing me would lead to all this? She gestured around their home, which had become the center of ongoing cultural exchange programs, diplomatic initiatives, and research into successful interspecies family structures. The peace negotiations, the colony settlements, the research programs that are helping other species learn to cooperate. David thought about the question seriously, remembering the moment when he decided to cross no man's land to investigate a thermal signature that might have been a child in need of help. I knew that leaving you there would have been wrong. Everything else, the diplomatic implications, the research opportunities, the way our relationship has influenced interspecies policy, I never could have predicted any of that. But you would have rescued me anyway, even if you'd known it would complicate everything. Kira, you were a hurt child who needed help. Nothing else would have mattered. David moved to sit beside her, reaching out to touch her hand in the gesture of connection that had become automatic for both of them. The complications have been worth it. Every single one of them. Kira's coloration shifted to the patterns David had learned indicated deep contentment and emotional security. I'm glad you found me, Dad. And I'm glad you didn't let the complications stop you from keeping me. I'm glad I found you too, little one. You've made my life more interesting, more meaningful, and significantly more complicated than I ever imagined possible. The afternoon brought visitors that represented the scope of change that had grown from David's impulsive rescue mission 2 years earlier. Ambassador Chen, no relation despite the shared name, arrived with a delegation of human diplomats, Kaelari cultural representatives, and even 2 Vrex observers whose presence indicated that the peace initiatives had expanded beyond the original human-Kaelari cooperation agreements. Kira took her place at the diplomatic table with the confidence of someone who'd grown up as both subject and participant in interspecies relations, her presence serving as a living reminder that successful cooperation between different species was not only possible but could create outcomes that benefited everyone involved. The colony integration programs have exceeded all projections, Ambassador Chen reported. Mixed species communities are showing higher innovation rates, better conflict resolution capabilities, and more effective resource utilization than single-species settlements. The success appears to be partially attributable to the cultural bridging work being done by individuals who understand multiple species perspectives, added Elder Thessarian. Young people like Bright Wing, who can communicate effectively with different species while maintaining their own cultural identity, are proving invaluable for community integration efforts. David watched as Kira participated in the discussion with insights that made the adult diplomats take notes, her unique perspective on interspecies communication informing policy decisions that would affect thousands of individuals across multiple worlds. Dad, Kira said during a break in the formal proceedings, do you think other rescued children could learn to do what we do? Help different species understand each other. I think, David replied, that there are probably other children from other species who need families, and other adults who are willing to take on the complications of interspecies adoption. If our experience is any guide, those relationships could create the foundation for cooperation that none of us have even imagined yet. Kira's response was the brilliant smile that had become David's favorite sight in any galaxy, accompanied by coloration patterns that indicated excitement about possibilities she was already starting to plan. "So we're not just a family," she said with the kind of certainty that made complex ideas sound simple, "we're a proof of concept for how different species can choose to be family with each other." "Yeah, little one," David said, pulling her into the kind of hug that had become their standard method for expressing affection that transcended the boundaries of either species' typical emotional communication. "I think that's exactly what we are." As the diplomatic session continued around them, David found himself thinking about the strange mathematics of compassion and consequence, how one decision to help a child in need had somehow grown into a foundation for interspecies cooperation that was changing the political landscape of three-star systems. Looking at Kira, who was currently explaining to a Vrex cultural observer why human emotional expressions shouldn't be interpreted as aggressive displays, David realized that the most important engineering project of his career hadn't involved building anything with his hands. It had involved building a family that proved different didn't mean incompatible, and that love could create bridges across any gap the universe might place between different forms of life. "Ready to go home and practice those boring wing exercises?" David asked as the diplomatic session wound down. "Ready to go home and plan the next cultural exchange program," Kira corrected with the kind of confidence that made David suspect she was going to grow up to revolutionize interspecies relations in ways that would make their current achievements look like preliminary experiments. "Same thing, really," David said, watching as his daughter prepared to fly home through the evening sky of Haven's Rest, her wings catching the light in patterns that seemed to celebrate the impossible beauty of families that chose to grow beyond the boundaries of biology, species, or any other limitation the universe thought it could impose on love.